Shalom. This week we are reading the penultimate Torah portion of the book of Breshit, Parashat Vayigash. There's only two words that you have to remember for Parashat Vayigash: recognition and reconciliation. Our parsha opens with one step made by Yehuda towards Yosef. We read, "Then Yehuda approached him and said, 'Please, my lord, let now your servant speak something into my lord's ears, and let not your wrath be kindled against your servant, for you are like Pharaoh.'" This first step made by Yehuda, the leader of the house of Leah, as it were, that branch of the family, towards Yosef, the leader of the house of Rachel, this step came about after years of bitter separation. Yosef welcomed this step, and it brought to the hoped-for peace between the brothers. But it was a very long time coming, a very difficult and painful process that led up to this scene. Along the way, there was base as well as baseless hatred manifest, and arguments and controversy, difficulties. How can this all be understood? I want to understand it on a simple level. There are so many ramifications of what this whole model really teaches, but on a simple level, this was certainly not the example that was learned from Yaakov's house. Is there any way for the fathers of the nation to behave in this manner? Is it not, is it impossible to escape the fate of such a legacy of animosity and confrontation? It seems to be a recurring theme throughout history. Yet, these steps that Yehuda took towards Yosef are expressed very beautifully by the prophet Ezekiel in the Haftarah, the prophetic reading that we'll be reading this Shabbat that goes along with Parashat Vayigash. We read from the vision of Ezekiel, chapter 37. Beginning in verse 15, we read, "And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, 'And you, son of man, take for yourself one stick, and write upon it for Judah, and for the children of Israel, his companions. And take one stick, and write upon it for Joseph, the stick of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel, his companions. And bring them close, one to the other, into one stick, and they shall be one in your hand. And when the children of your people say to you, saying, Will you not tell us what these are to you? Say to them, So says the Lord God, Behold, I will take the stick of Joseph, which is in the hand of Ephraim, and the tribes of Israel, his companions, and I will place them with him with the stick of Judah, and I will make them into one stick, and they shall become one in my hand.'" How great, how awesome is Ezekiel's vision, what it really means. You know, throughout history, there are so many different levels of meaning and interpretation that have been applied and continue to be applied to this chapter. And they're all, of course, very important, and there are so many levels of meaning of Torah. So we have applications of this vision that have meaning on an individual level, on a national level, and on an international level. They've all been given to these passages. But again, I'm striving today for a simple level of understanding, and I think that these verses in Ezekiel not only lend tremendous understanding to what was really the problem between Yosef and his brothers, I believe that these verses in Ezekiel actually contain a formula, secret for the survival, for the destiny, for the success of Israel and Israel's spiritual legacy, Israel's mission. We read, "They shall be as one." You see, we know that the brothers did not recognize Yosef when they came to him in Egypt to buy grain. And this has always been considered a tremendous mystery that's interpreted in different ways. How could it be that they didn't recognize him just because he was older now? And people say, well, it's because they weren't expecting him. They weren't expecting him to be in this situation. On a very simple level, they didn't recognize him also because they didn't recognize him, they didn't appreciate him, they didn't recognize his worth. Our great sages have taught the unity of the tribes of Israel emanates from the consolidation, the unification of the power of Yehuda with the power of Yosef. And don't forget that these two forces throughout history, they also represent the Messianic redemption, but different parts of it, different stages. They represent different walks, different ways of serving God that might seem, on the surface, to an onlooker, to be in opposition. But in truth, Yehuda and Yosef complement each other. But this consolidation, this unification, can only come about through, meaning because of, as a result of, as a product of the contradictions and differences between them. That's what brings about the unification, the recognition of their differences. In our Haftarah, the prophetic reading from Ezekiel, God commands the prophet Ezekiel to take 2 sticks, not 1 stick that contains all of Israel, but in stages, the stick of Yehuda alone and the stick of Ephraim alone, and only then to bring them together to be one in your hand. People have a tendency to disqualify each other. They become very intolerant. In order to reconcile the differences which seem like contradictions within the nation of Israel, we are being taught here that it is imperative for there to be a recognition that there's a place and a purpose for every opinion, for every group, for every position, and that these positions have the right to be expressed and heard. They need to be expressed, and true Jewish leadership should be concerned, should concern itself with the concern of the Torah, which is seeing to it that all these seemingly opposing elements within the body of Israel unify and become one. Because within the nation, the saga of Yehuda and Yosef teaches us that within the nation there are diverse talents, strengths that may ostensibly seem to be in opposition. Religious versus secular, faith versus disbelief, modern versus old, all sorts of elements that seem to be tugging away at each other. But in Ezekiel's great vision, God told him, they shall be one in your hand. Because all the diverse elements must be allowed to blossom and grow together to become one. The brothers' attempt to isolate and disconnect Yosef from their midst and to essentially disqualify his positions that were different from theirs, when they did this, they used all sorts of sophisticated reasoning, excuses based on what they thought was sound halachic reasoning, as it were. They wanted to kill him. They wanted to kill him for the sake of heaven. But it didn't work, and it never will. And there must not and never should be another such schism within the people of Israel. And of course, this has an extremely contemporary ring. And the dissing of someone else and the attempt to create divisions within the people for the sake of heaven is exactly what brought about the destruction of the Second Temple. And so here, simply put, is the secret of the brothers not recognizing Yosef. They did not appreciate his individuality and thus sought, in the extreme, to delegitimize him. In our generation, we cannot afford to return to this mistake. And here is the inner meaning, obviously, the secret of our sages' enigmatic teaching that the sale of Yosef by his brothers was a sin of such severity and magnitude that it must be atoned for in every generation. They simply put, the tikkun, the rectification of the brother's sin, will be when Israel is totally accepting, reconciled to, in full recognition of all of her various parts. And the alternative is disaster, as alluded to by none other than King Solomon. We have the famous story in the book of Kings of the judgment of Solomon. 1 Kings chapter 3. 2 women that came and argued over a child. And the king said, this one says, this is my son that lives, and your son is the dead one. And the other says, not so, your son is the dead one and my son is the living one. And the king said, fetch me a sword. And they brought a sword before the king, and the king said, divide the living child in two and give half to the one and half to the other. And the woman, whose son was the live one, said to the king, for her compassion was aroused for her son, and she said, O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means slay him. But the other said, let it be neither mine nor yours, divide it. And that is exactly what division is, and this is the secret that these verses are teaching us. Just death for its own sake. And the king answered and said, give her the living child, and by no means slay him. She is the mother. Verse 28 there concludes, and all of Israel heard the judgment which the king had judged, and they feared the king, for they saw that the wisdom of God was in him to do judgment. So you see, it's important, the verses emphasize to us, all of Israel, collectively, the entire nation, heard the judgment and understood exactly what this meant, what division really is. The ultimate and true tikkun, rectification of the brothers of Yosef, will happen with the return of unity to our people. A unity that does not rise from the delegitimizing of any sector, but from recognizing and appreciating the value and contribution of every individual and the careful consideration of every position, even those that might seem to be out of sync with our own. As the great Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak HaKohen Kook said, let each man glean all that is good and proper from his friend, all that which is pleasant and upright, for all these will lead to a sure recognition that only through the spiritual unification of all of Israel, the old and the young together, will arise the deliverance and sprout forth the redemption.